Good day, everyone. My name is David Williams, Executive Director of the International Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled The Vast New Landscape of Minerals and Materials for Energy. We are grateful to Dr. Tristan Abbey, who is President, Commerce Analytics, for today's timely discussion. We're also grateful to our distinguished panelists. First, a little bit about the International Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest association specializing in the field of energy economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations, along with a host of other products and services that you can find at our website at www.iaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our moderator. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions for our panelists, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window and type your question. We've allocated sufficient time at the end of this webinar to address your questions. And now I would like to introduce you to our presider and speaker, Dr. Tristan Abbey, President at Commerce Analytics. Tristan, over to you.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction. In fact, it was just a tad too kind. I am not a doctor, though I do play one on TV. We are at somewhat of a disadvantage this morning because our scheduled moderator, Michot Foss, apparently is stuck in the snowstorm down in Houston, or the power outages associated with it. So I'll be filling in for her until when and if she can find her way onto the webinar. She was unfortunately also supposed to provide our supply and disposition of raw materials section. So I will do my best to fill in for her on that and save her some time, of course, if she's able to join us in the end. As anyone who is signing into this webinar should know, critical minerals and other raw materials are absolutely essential to our energy future, whether it's the current grid and the current fleet of generators, or it's the future of renewable technology, advanced nuclear. Everywhere you look, you have different kinds of minerals that have to be taken out of the ground somewhere. And once they're taken out of the ground, they have to be separated and processed and refined somewhere. And once they're used, they end up in some kind of trash heap somewhere, and that can or may not be, as is too often the case, recycled into something usable. And that itself is a chemical process that has to occur somewhere. And with the constellation of forces that are arrayed against extractive industries or against building new complicated plants of industrial scale, it is difficult to establish a supply chain, particularly in countries that have very strong environmental regimes, which of course is not a bad thing either. And so there's this tension between extraction and environmental protection that we see all over the industry, and not just in minerals, of course, but also in oil and gas, and even in the deployment of renewable technology. There is one common misconception about critical minerals that I think is worth stating at the outset and just sort of clarifying. Critical minerals and rare earth elements are not synonymous. Rare earth elements are just one of the 35 commodity minerals that have been identified by the U.S. Geological Survey as critical minerals. The way that the USGS made its list was to look at a bunch of different factors. Of course, its criticality to certain sectors of the economy, and also import dependence. Import dependence is very important, and that is often a quick and easy metric to use to try to identify whether a mineral may or may not be in short supply or could be interrupted in the future, either through some kind of natural disaster or war, or as the case may be, a pandemic, for instance. And so all of these different issues come up in minerals, discussions on the policy side, but also on the commercial side. The reason why it's important to recognize that rare earth elements are not the same thing as critical minerals, although they are one kind, is that there are also many different kinds of rare earth elements. That is the lanthanide series on your periodic table. It's extremely complicated to get these rare earth elements out of the ground because they occur together, and so you have to separate them. Again, that is a chemical process. That is challenging technically, and it's expensive. And as with all things, it produces some degree of waste. The other reason why it's important to draw a distinction between critical minerals and rare earth elements is that there are many critical minerals that you've probably heard of that are used every day. For example, chromium, cobalt, lithium, things that are used in batteries. Battery technology is one dimension of one newer dimension, I would say, of the minerals landscape. Where over the past 10 years or so, you've seen a lot more talk, a lot more discussion about the importance of minerals to batteries, which are essential for electric vehicles, which many would believe, according to all the projections, would be important for the greening of the global energy production system, such as it is a system at all, which arguably it actually consists of many different little systems. The other new dimension of critical minerals is in the renewable energy technology itself. So actually in the solar and wind production sites. This is where the energy of the sun and the wind is converted into electricity. And while you don't necessarily need critical minerals to build a windmill, we've actually been building windmills for 1,000 years. But you do need to have minerals if you want them to be efficient, if you want them to be effective at contributing real significant volumes of electricity to the grid. You need critical minerals if you want them essentially to have high capacity factors, that is to be to use as much of the energy that they can as possible. It is no coincidence that semiconductors, which are used in, of course, in electronics, use the same kind of silicon that is used in solar panels. This is all about somewhat technical, but not too technical, basic high school, college chemistry and physics. And minerals are critical at all parts of that value chain as well. Then, of course, in advanced nuclear, you need minerals for the cladding, for the fuel production, for all sorts of things that go into advanced reactors that are being developed. And I think over the next couple of years, exploring the degree to which minerals have what you might call strategic depth within the broader energy sector, I think is going to be a very exciting time for researchers and economists and anyone studying this field. So with that sort of scene setter, I'll pass it over to Rachel Meidl, who will speak for about 10 minutes. We'll do some brief discussion with her, then I'll start my presentation. And if and when Michelle joins us, we'll do more Q&A, but if she doesn't, I will fill in for her going forward. So over to you, Rachel.
All right, thank you, Tristan. Good morning, everybody. Let me share my screen with you. I too am in Houston, and so have been affected by this inclement weather. Been without water for several days and without power intermittently. So it's been a bit of a challenge for for all of us. But I will I'll try to get through this, and hopefully Michelle can join us, and she'll be an excellent addition to this discussion. But so I want to talk about mainly from this perspective. About the end of life management, life cycle, sustainability, because I think those things largely are overlooked when we talk about the energy transition in general. And so what you see on this screen is a rudimentary life cycle assessment. And this is something I put together for that was meant to convey how intricate the process can be. And this is specifically for the battery supply chain. And it is overly simplified for those of you that are familiar with this. But life cycle assessments, or LCAs as I'll call them, they take what is known as a cradle to grave approach at evaluating the impacts across the entire life cycle. So that means from really R&D to raw materials extraction to materials manufacture, product manufacture, consumer use, and then final disposal. And so they are very important to inform decision making. And the outcome of the LCAs, it's largely dependent on the scope and the boundaries and how far up and down the supply chain that you assess. So they do have a propensity for misinterpretation. So for example, are you assessing the life cycle of only the product manufacturing process or the product manufacturing process in the use phase? LCAs, in this sense, they can be useful for identifying the bottlenecks or deficiencies and creating operational efficiencies within those parameters, but it can't be used to justify systems level sustainability or to guide national and global policy decisions, which it's has in the past currently been used in those cases. And especially since traditional life cycle assessments, they really just assess the environmental impacts from an emissions perspective. They don't include the full range of environmental impacts. A lot of them don't look at global climate change and ozone depletion, eutrophication, and depleting of natural resources and how it affects biodiversity and things like that. And they also don't include a social impact or an economic impact. And all of these components are really necessary to assess sustainability, because sustainability really is this equilibrium of all three of those things. So we're omitting the full spectrum of metrics, essentially, so you're not typically including mining and processing, smelting, trade, transportation between all of these things, and the waste associated between each one of this network within each of these segments. And we're not looking at the social, economic, and environmental costs when we're determining the sustainability of the energy transition. And so what we're not doing is the things that I've highlighted here are the raw materials acquisition phase and the end of life data and metrics. These are largely omitted in life cycle assessments, and they're really not prevalent in conversations around strategic planning and the energy transition. And they're not being taken into account, what happens at this stage. For example, how are the lithium ion batteries from electric vehicles and energy storage systems, or the electronic waste and solar panels and wind turbine blades and components, how are they being managed at the end of life, and where are they managed, and how do these factor into its overall sustainability score? And so this right here, it's not meant for you to read, all of these things, but I threw this all together, and it's an overview of all the different agencies and controlling statutes and standards, regulations of the supply chain of activities for batteries and for e-waste as well, since those are concatenated in many ways from a classification and definition standpoint. But this is primarily from the US perspective. And keep in mind, this is only my limited perspective as well in my area of expertise. So this is not comprehensive. But the bottom line here is that we have a multitude of regulatory agencies and independent inspection authorities, standard setting bodies, international entities that all have different jurisdictions across the life cycle of all of these different energy transition technologies. And there are important export laws to consider, EU's REACH and US's TSCA regulation, among others. We have international treaties like the Basel Convention, and we have different environment, health, safety, and security laws and regulations, and their equivalents in other countries. So with this uncharted labyrinth, the question that I oftentimes ask is, what are all of the current regulations, laws, policies, and so forth that cover all of the activities across the life cycle for materials extraction, handling, storage, transportation, safety, emergency response, waste disposal, recycling, exporting, all of these things. And how do they overlap and interact? Are there gaps? that we need to consider, and do they conflict with one another? And are all of these different policies adequate to cover the current and future goals of growth, of production, and sustainability and waste management? And the answer to this is we don't know, especially when it comes to the end of life and waste management aspect of it. And so this So this is meant to convey that, tracking waste is complicated and in some cases impossible. So because of this, data is scarce and unreliable. Data tracking on e-waste and batteries and other materials that don't clearly fall within the definition of hazardous waste, and the data associated with this, of its final treatment and disposal, is really dismal. And this is because there's no global consensus on the legal definition of e-waste, or what even constitutes e-waste. And so, so you'll see that e-waste or in lithium-ion batteries, so all of these can really truly be categorized as one. So we have lithium-ion batteries in electric vehicles, solar panels, wind turbine components, electric vehicle components, different energy storage systems, and of course, the ones that people are familiar with, like the consumer electronic devices and batteries contained in equipment. So we really have no national and federal regulation or classification. It's largely driven by the states right now, if at all. And every country establishes their own list of end-of-life products that qualify as e-waste. And so all of these items could technically be classified into one of these 4 broad categories of non-hazardous waste, or reuse or as a commodity in a secondary market, or hazardous waste, or even a subcategory of universal waste. And I know, you could spend days just talking about what all this means, but the point here is that all of these classifications and all of these pathways make it very challenging to trace and to track, because there's a number of different reporting obligations, and the way that those interact and the systems that they use and how they capture that information and access information is all very, very murky. And so all of this, of course, varies by state, it varies by country. And so the data really gets lost in the classification, and the classification is what ultimately drives which database it gets pulled through, and to a lesser extent where it ends up at the end of life. And so that means whether it gets landfilled or goes for reuse or recycling or exported. So really we need better data, and that's needed to create a more comprehensive picture of the overall trade flows, both domestically and internationally, and to prepare for the responsible management at the end of life. So we need accurate information about the amounts, the types of materials, and the destination of all of these materials and where they're managed. And this will provide valuable information for governments and private industry and other stakeholders, and it'll help us sustainably advance through the energy transition. And so I put this together, and this data is from the UN Comtrade database. And the point I want to make with this is, okay, so this is world trade flows of waste and spent batteries, and I think it's from 1988 to 2018, and it's a time-lapse visualization of trade flows. And a transition towards a more resource efficient and a more circular economy, it really has broad linkages to international trade. And I show this slide only to demonstrate the interconnectedness of our global economy and how reliant we've become on foreign governments for supply and for waste management. Our supply chains are inextricably linked, which is why the decisions that we make at the local and the regional, the national levels should also keep in mind the global context. The pandemic clearly has illustrated just how connected our societies are. And if we want to have a more circular and sustainable future, we have to be cognizant of the global picture, and not understanding the larger perspective or having a clear picture of end-of-life management of these new energy technologies and renewable technologies and options or future waste volumes is going to be an obstacle for achieving sustainability in the energy transition. So we need to really prioritize life cycle insights and obtain more data and more reliable data to understand what those trade-offs are and what those potential unintended consequences might be. So ensuring that we identify and quantify all of these impacts on a systems level basis and making informed decisions based off of robust, accurate data is what's going to lead us to an energy transition that is environmentally sustainable and socially just and economically viable. So I will turn it back to you, Tristan. And let me just stop sharing my screen here.
Well, thanks so much for that fantastic presentation, Rachel. I think the slides say it all. If you're trying to prove that we are inextricably linked to the world, you've certainly done that. And if you're trying to prove that the regulations and the laws associated with waste management are complicated, I think those slides also get that job done. One follow-up question for you before I start my own presentation. When I work on nuclear energy policy on the Hill or inside the administration over the past few years, nuclear waste, waste from the clean, efficient nuclear power that we all talk about. I think many Americans would be probably a little shocked to learn that we're not really doing very much on nuclear waste. If we never get our hands around mineral waste for batteries or for electronics, what happens? I mean, you had the slide about the labyrinth of laws and regulations. What if we never find our way out of that labyrinth?
I was muted there. Yeah, and that's the tricky thing, with this, and that's why strategizing and understanding what these impacts are and getting ahead of all this is so important, because with the onset of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and global sustainability targets, and with a push for ESGs and all of these global climate goals, there's so much pressure from governments and the public and shareholders to align with all of these commitments and to decarbonize. But if we don't have a good sense of what that means downstream, it's going to be a true impact to our economy and to society. And so we really have to start devising and concatenating the energy industry with the waste industry and start thinking about what do these policies look like, and really even before that, quantifying and commissioning perhaps a national study on projected renewable energy waste quantities and the types of those. And I think some of those will help inform some of our decision making for developing policies. It will allow governments to strengthen our domestic capabilities and plan for appropriate management, and then also for investments into the technologies that we need for these. But it's not something that's not something that we can disregard. I mean, it's truly important when you look at some of the waste volumes that are out there that are coming online and that are already out there. Like when I spoke about the e-waste and lithium ion batteries, it's really abysmal, and we need to get ahead of that.
Thanks so much. I'm going to share my screen and hope my computer doesn't crash. So my job here today for the next 10 minutes is to talk about federal policy outlook for critical minerals and to identify some of the policy gaps, particularly when it comes to strategic thinking on the minerals landscape. As a way of brief background, I served as the chief energy economist for the GOP side on the Senate Energy Committee, and also as director for strategic planning at the National Security Council. From 2017 to 2019, then came back to the Senate in 2019 through 2020. So minerals has always been at least on the periphery of my work, and has become lately the centerpiece of it. So very briefly, I'll cover White House and executive interagency. That is all the departments and agencies that make up what we know as the federal government. In theory, all the departments and agencies of the executive branch respond to direction from the White House. In practice, that is not always the case. The second point on the agenda, the landscape in Congress. While it is easy to make fun of Congress, it is also true, I think, that the current makeup of Congress, especially over the past couple of years, has never been more interested in minerals. certainly at least generationally, if not ever. And I include concerns about minerals during the First and Second World Wars. And then finally, some wrap-up thoughts on a semblance of a conclusion, although these thoughts are less conclusive and more teeing up for further discussion. So on the left here, we've got Jennifer Granholm, the Honorable Jennifer Granholm, former governor of Michigan. She was recently nominated to be the Secretary of Energy for the incoming administration. She passed out of the Senate Energy Committee and now is currently waiting on the floor for a floor vote before she can be confirmed. One of the ways that administration policy is made is through these nomination hearings that every nominee has to go through. They're asked a number of questions privately and publicly, privately in meetings with individual senators, but also publicly during the hearing. They commit to various things or not to do various things. And some of their commitments or lack thereof engender some kind of controversy. And whatever answer they give then becomes effectively administration policy in theory. And Granholm was asked on several occasions about critical minerals and her view on critical minerals. And she was broadly supportive of efforts to develop more critical minerals in the US domestically. The other way, other than the sort of questioning in public or private, where the individual is essentially forced to make a statement one way or the other, is to provide questions for the record. And these questions are submitted in writing and answers are provided in writing. And of course, in government, because so much of what we do is in writing, if you get it in writing, that means all the world. And so this is a quote from her responses to the questions for the record, which were submitted by then Chairman Lisa Murkowski from Alaska. She was asked about minerals, and I won't read the whole answer for you, but you can look at it. And this is something that a Trump official could say. This is all about the importance of reliability of supply, the importance of minerals to climate goals. Well, the Trump official may not mention climate goals, but certainly clean energy goals, certainly renewable energy and batteries, other technologies. Those other technologies might include advanced nuclear. Industry supported by critical minerals, that is different parts of the supply chain. This answer is basically the perfect answer for someone who wants to get confirmed by a Senate committee that cares very deeply about energy and natural resources. And other parts of her answers for the record, she mentions 3 offices at the Department of Energy: the Office of Fossil Energy, ARPA-E, this is the Advanced Research Projects Agency E, Energy, and the Loan Program Office. The Loan Program Office is the most interesting of these 3 based on interesting recent developments. I realize that's redundant. It's a multi-billion-dollar portfolio, and it rose to prominence about 15 years ago now, maybe 10 years ago, when it invested in some failing energy projects. Solyndra is what most people think of when they think about this Loan Program Office. But in reality, its authorities are pretty broad. It can invest in a whole lot of different things. And one of the final acts of the Trump administration was to finalize a new rule at the Loan Program Office. It's more of a policy than a rule that allows the Loan Program Office to provide financing for critical minerals projects that can help reduce carbon emissions. And when people think about that, they think about batteries, nuclear, and renewables. And so to date, the Loan Program Office hasn't provided that financing, but now they are able to. And future Secretary Granholm, if she's confirmed, committed in writing to furthering that policy that was announced back in December and then finalized in January. ARPA-C has also been talked about as a Advanced Research Projects Agency for climate. Many people who watch the X-Files may recall DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. And the whole idea of ARPA as a concept is that you have the best and brightest scientists working on cutting edge, conceptual, theoretical, and practical problems, and they can provide their expertise with federal dollars to come up with innovative solutions to a whole range of things. The Office of Fossil Energy is on this list obviously because fossil is the closest to extractive that the Department of Energy can get, but it's also involved on the mineral side, most recently in funding studies about how to extract rare earth elements from coal and coal byproducts. There is a policy gap in the federal landscape, however. As you know, this is a slide about DOE, Department of Energy. Where is the Department of Interior? Where is the Department of Defense? In truth, you could have a slide on each of those, and they're all doing various things. DOD, of course, is always the giant aircraft carrier of the federal government, extremely powerful, but hard to maneuver. DOD has the National Defense Stockpile, which contains dozens of minerals and other commodities. These, of course, are used for defense purposes. There's a very clear line between defense purposes, DOD dollars, and civilian purposes, which could be DOE. DOD, in practice, doesn't like to share its authorities. These authorities are given to it by Congress, and it likes to use these authorities for its defense purposes. And when the lines start to get blurred, DOD often gets in trouble. And so DOD is very reluctant to kind of take an expansive view of its role in the US civilian economy. Towards the end of the administration, last year, you did see moves by DOD to invest in parts of the critical mineral supply chain, which could, in theory, have civilian impacts. Over at Interior is very important because it's got all the geologists, it's got the US Geological Survey, it does the mining, or it oversees the mining activity on federal land. And under the previous administration, it was very active in the mineral space. In fact, the executive order that was promulgated in December of 2017 emanated at first from Interior, where it did the whole annual survey of mineral commodities. It included the critical minerals list that was finally published in the Federal Register. And this is a list that will be updated, again, based on the import dependence and its criticality in different parts of the supply chain. So Interior is a big player, or could be. The question is, will it? Will DOE and DOI and DOD work together on addressing the critical minerals challenge? There is no forcing function that requires them to work together. You can have a meeting and everyone can come to the meeting and read from the same sheet of paper, but when it comes to actually doing things, and that is spending federal dollars, there is no forcing function to get them to work together. This is kind of a interagency challenge across the board in a whole number of different policy areas. But I think in minerals, it is especially pronounced, especially if you have, in contrast to the previous administration, which had pretty much lockstep uniform support for minerals across the departments and agencies. In this administration, you're going to have a little more complicated of an arrangement where certain departments will be more responsive to environmental concerns than others. Others will be less responsive to the extractive industry than others. And you'll see less cohesion within the administration of minerals. But so far, the signals have been positive, especially from Granholm. The second slide here is the landscape in Congress. On the right here, you've got pictures of Lisa Murkowski and Joe Manchin. These are the respective leaders of the Senate Energy Committee. Until recently, Senator Murkowski is no longer the senior GOP senator on that committee because of term limits on the committee. But one of her special initiatives has been highlighting the critical minerals issue for the past 10 years. And the American Mineral Security Act, or various parts of it, have been introduced repeatedly over the years, over the past decade. They have not received as much attention, perhaps, as they were due. And then finally, just 2 days after Christmas in December, we have Division Z, the Energy Act of 2020. Title VII of that is the bulk of the Critical Minerals Security Act, Title VII. And this, of course, was contained in the giant omnibus, the Consolidated Appropriations of 2021. This was the coronavirus package, the CARES Act 2.0. That got all this controversy because it's 1,000 pages long and no one's read it. and it has all these different things in it that aren't related to COVID. Well, that was a little unfair because it is the Consolidated Appropriations Act. It is not just COVID. It includes basically everything from every committee that was ready to go at the time. Whenever you hear about an omnibus or a minibus, if they were smaller than an omnibus, or any kind of consolidated appropriations, it's about dealing with a package of bills that have been cleared, bipartisan, bicameral, that are ready to go, and you put it all together, and that's how you get it across the finish line. So this is more evidence that the Congress is extremely interested in minerals, but interest is not the same as dollars. There is funding for certain mineral projects within this Title VII, but there is still a fairly large gap in the strategic thinking about the mineral supply chain in Congress, and that is between the extractives and the end of life. You have a lot of attention on the extractive side because people think about mining jobs, and you have a lot of attention on the recycling side because people think about what to do with waste. There is very little focus on separation, processing, refining of minerals. This is a huge challenge, I think, conceptually for Congress because it requires the building of industrial scale facilities. But there is this gap between money for things that are other than R&D and studies to admire the problem, which we're very good at, but carrying that money to the action part, rather than a request for information, how about a request for action? There is a lack of policy attention for things other than either extraction or recycling. It's that sort of middle part of the supply chain. And really the gap boils down to a question. What is the point of doing all this work on minerals and recycling if you don't address the middle of the supply chain? And what is the point of extracting more minerals if you still have to ship those minerals to China to get processed and then ship them back? If you read the critical minerals summaries from the USGS, which are freely available online, you'll find all sorts of interesting trade linkages where we will produce the raw ore of some mineral and ship it to some other country across the ocean. They'll process it and ship it back to us. And that doesn't necessarily reduce your import dependence. And if import dependence isn't your metric, and it may not be, but then what is? And we're not really having that conversation. So those are the two policy gaps. Broadly speaking, one is the interagency gaps between DOD, DOI, and DOD, which have different authorities, different responsibilities, and they don't necessarily have to work together. And then a policy gap on the Congress side, which is dealing with the minerals space in a way that goes further than just extraction. And Division Z, of course, does include things other than extraction, but there's relatively less focus on things other than extraction. Even I think recycling gets less attention than extraction does. And so there's I think an urgent need to address all parts of that supply chain. So to wrap up my presentation, this is an equation that may be familiar to many people. Acceleration equals force divided by mass. People may know also it as force equals mass times acceleration. Acceleration is the change in velocity or direction. And to really accelerate the federal government, which is one of the most massive objects in the universe, you need to have a lot of force. Unfortunately, it has been difficult for either the Congress or the White House to exert force on this massive object of the federal government. And as a result, we have not seen much change in direction or change in speed. While it is a terrific thing that the American Mineral Security Act was included, at least large portions of it were included in the COVID response bill, it was Division Z. And so if you're talking about priorities, Z's not the worst. ZZ would be the worst, but it's certainly not the best. And when it comes to prioritizing our priorities, that is the third and final policy gap that I would draw our attention to. And so with that, I think I'm going to pass it back to IAEE to help us run our Q&A here. It looks like Michelle will not be joining us, so that is unfortunate. But over to you, IAEE.
Thank you, Tristan. So we do have one question right now from Gershon Gulen. It's for Rachel. You've made a comment where LCA is appropriate and where it is not. Perhaps I misunderstood, but could you please explain your comment a bit more?
Yes, sure, absolutely. So the point I was making about the life cycle assessments is that, right now when we, I've assessed and analyzed a lot of different LCAs out there, and many times, I mean, you could, if you're just looking at all of the impacts, for example, in the product manufacturing process. So you're just looking at emissions and maybe waste associated with that. You're omitting the rest of the supply chain. So you're not looking at emissions and waste and other environmental impacts associated with the materials manufacture or the product consumption use phase or final disposal. So if we rely on the data and the outputs associated with that particular life cycle assessment, we're really not understanding the larger picture and the impacts associated with the larger picture. And a lot of times, some of these arguments that you see on whether or not we should use renewables or certain renewables because of different impacts. A lot of them are not looking at the entire life cycle. They're looking at small pieces of that. And so we really have to be careful about the scope and the boundaries with that and how we communicate that information, because if we truly want to reach sustainability or look at things holistically, then we have to include all of those data and all of the metrics associated with what the boundaries are and communicate that appropriately. Otherwise we're getting an incomplete picture of what the impacts are. But now if you're working in a facility or an operation and you want to understand and create some operational efficiencies. I mean, certainly life cycle assessments are great for looking at just certain segments of the supply chain, but they certainly can't be used to justify a policy shift or a change. We really have to understand what that bigger picture is. So really, it's all about scope and boundary when we're talking about life cycle assessments.
Yep. Thank you very much. So Tim Considine asked the following question: what are the barriers to entry for critical mineral processing? Tristan, maybe you'd like to have a go at that?
Yes, the barriers are extremely high. And I think the slides that Rick provided were showing all the very complicated interactions of the statutes and oversight agencies, I think, speak to that. And that is just on, and that's just on the waste side. There's economic challenges for sure when it comes to building new processing facilities, in part because the supply chain exists already. And so you have companies that have diversified globally parts of their supply chain. In China, in other places around the world, South America, there's lots of linkages with Argentina, with Morocco, for example, plays a unique role in that. I believe it's the phosphate market. And so there's all these different little stories you can tell about mineral extraction and processing that result in these complicated trade linkages. But I think an analogy might be to look at the oil and gas industry, where it is relatively easy to drill a new oil well. You can go get a permit if you have the capital for it. You can get the permit from whether it's a state agency. Those are especially easy compared to the federal government, which is why Texas and North Dakota have seen such incredible increases in their production versus areas of federal land like in Alaska, where it's much more difficult to get permitted. But broadly, if you want to produce American oil, you can figure out how to do that with some ease. However, it's that middle part of the supply chain, the processing, building an oil refinery, that is extremely difficult. In fact, I believe the last substantial US oil refinery was built about 40 years ago. This is a story that you can tell across different parts of the energy-related supply chain, different sectors of the economy. You see it is extremely difficult to build the processing part because of the environmental regs, because these are chemical processing plants when it comes down to it. You have a lot of waste, a lot of pollution, things that have to be addressed. And it's just much easier to drill the oil well than it is to build a refinery that produces the gasoline that makes the oil actually useful. I think that broadly speaking is what we see here in the minerals chain, where it's much easier to drill the oil than it is to get a pipeline built. And it's much easier to build a pipeline than it is to build a refinery. And it's even easier to build a refinery probably than it is to deal with nuclear waste.
Yeah,
Rachel, I was just going to say, do you have any builds on that?
Well, I just wanted to add to what Tristan was saying, and he mentioned this in his presentation on the interagency challenges and the gaps associated with that, which I think is extensive. And I think an area where it truly is a barrier to progression in this area. I mean, because with the agencies that he's mentioned, the State Department with all of the treaties that we have, and of course EPA and DOT, OSHA and CBP, but that's not it. I mean, a lot of our regulations and a lot of our performance standards and other standards that are actually built into our regulations culminate at the international level. And so a lot of this and a lot of the negotiation happens at the UN, in which case then it has to be brought down to the domestic level and rulemaking commenced with that. And so it's a complicated process. It's a very protracted process. But when you start looking at our complicated and interwoven trade patterns, when you comes down to the minerals and even the products where you want to recycle or to reuse these things, a lot of this is traded through different networks. And if we use things like, the Basel Convention, even though the US is not party to the Basel Convention, but we do all of our trading with parties, that are, there's provisions in the convention for recycling and reclamation, and lithium and cobalt are classified as waste under this convention, which has really inhibited their later use. There's also a lack of definition for all of these things. There's a lack of definition for recovery and remanufacturing and repurposing or reuse. And so these have been major barriers to developing a common understanding and subsequently a business case for these processes. And so, if we truly are, trading on the open market and a lot of our waste is sent overseas, and some of it with the intent for, as a commodity or the secondary market, there's a lot to contend with, looking at some of these treaties and looking at how our regulations intersect with these.
Good. A couple more good questions have come in. This one is from Tim Fitzgerald. Many different minerals are produced and consumed in the economy. From a legal and regulatory perspective, where are the boundaries on critical or strategic minerals that define the scope of government efforts in the area of energy and prevent government intervention in the form of a broader industrial policy? Put another way, how do these efforts not creep into virtually every sector of the economy?
Well, if this is the Tim Fitzgerald I know and used to work with, hi, Tim. If not, I apologize for being really awkward right now. I think that the issue with broader industrial policy is a real one. I think that the politics of this are that we are very much headed in that way. There's growing support on the GOP side, which is perhaps unusual for those who associate free market economics with the GOP side, in some kind of industrial policy. Right now, I think that interest is narrowly focused on the minerals piece, but also perhaps on things like AI and quantum computing, where we're competing with China. And the industrial policy focus is very much on China and the US competition with China. That is kind of a de facto boundary of some kind, but it's also, I think, something of a murky, fuzzy boundary. And so I think the point Tim makes is good. I would say that over the past 100 years, the U.S. has been playing, the U.S. federal government has been playing in the mineral sector. We have the National Helium Reserve built after World War I. That of course resulted in all sorts of economic questions as well as the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the National Defense Stockpile, and even say the HHS's stockpile of N95 masks and ventilators. All these questions have come up about stockpiling, which is in some ways philosophically a kind of industrial policy. And of course, when it comes to minerals, we're not talking only about stockpiling. We're also talking about supply chain support. But I think it's a good question, and it's one that will be with us, I think, perhaps without resolution.
Okay, Gurjan has another one. Thanks. A shout out to you, Rachel, for the reply on the last one. And Tristan, do you think developing mineral supply chains and manufacturing of wind, solar, and battery equipment in the U.S. will get widespread public acceptance that can be translated into bipartisan political support?
I hope so. And this is me ticking off my analyst hat and putting on my advocate hat. I think it's really important that we do that. I think it's important that we get the bipartisan political support. I will say that there are some indications that that may not happen. There are some indications that say it will happen. I think if you think back to the slide about Jennifer Granholm, that is a slide that would indicate that we are headed that way towards bipartisan acceptance. However, there are indications that we may not. Most of the effort on minerals has been a Republican idea. And most of the hesitance on minerals has been kind of a Democratic thing. This is not set in stone; things can change. But if you think about, say, natural gas, 10 years ago, natural gas was kind of a sleeper issue. We were just dealing with the boom in the Appalachians and elsewhere around the country, and flaring was becoming a slight issue in North Dakota. Things were still very new. We were grappling with how to export natural gas as LNG through these large ocean-going carriers. Natural gas was viewed as a climate-friendly solution because of its relatively low carbon emissions compared to coal. There was a pretty workable bipartisan group of senators and congressmen who were willing to play when it came to natural gas pipelines and LNG exports. Natural gas very much was a bipartisan issue. You saw the Obama administration handle that with its various members of the administration trying to sort out what its natural gas policy was. You had, of course, people that were a little skeptical of it, and people that were very much in favor of it. And in the end, they settled down on a very pro LNG export policy. Fast forward to 2021, and I think the bipartisan support for natural gas has frayed significantly, and the future for natural gas in the U.S. is somewhat uncertain now. And I think one of the challenges for the mineral supply chain is avoiding that fate, and that will require, I think, a lot of public education, a lot of education of policymakers, but also persuasion, because this is a new issue that people don't fully understand. And I think perhaps the persuasive talents of certain parts of the supply chain could use improvement, especially when it comes to processing with chemicals. I think many people are very skittish about that kind of thing. And they may not realize how much chemical processing goes on in your everyday life. But I think that's a good question. Again, as an advocate for minerals, I hope that comes to pass, but I'm just not sure it will.
Gotcha. Okay, we're just about up to the top of our hour here. Perhaps upon closing, do either Rachel or Tristan, do you have questions for each other, reflecting upon your presentations? Not necessary. Just wondering if you had any last minute comments. So I think we'll bring a close now to this webinar. I want to thank both of you very much for your time and your expertise. Truly a fascinating topic. This is minerals were here to begin with. They're not going away, and going to be more and more of an important topic. So for our listeners today, thank you very much. This has been recorded. It will be available on our Rewind station. We give a shout out to our non-members as well. We encourage you to check us out, www.iaee.org. We welcome you to join our society. And for the rest of you, please wish to have a good rest of your day wherever this finds you on our fine globe. I officially close this webinar. Bye now.
Thanks
Thanks
all.
for having us.